Hey y'all, it's Trisha Lynn, and welcome back to Crime 1-1, where we definitely do not like talking about crime whatsoever. Right. The matter I'm going to talk about today is a case that struck a chord with me because it reminds me in certain ways of one I discussed previously concerning a guy named Al Kite. He lived in Aurora, Colorado, and was found gruesomely tortured and murdered in his house in May of 2004. As of now, over 18 years later, his killer remains uncaught and unidentified, but it is presumed to be this mysterious stranger who showed up in town and went around posing as a prospective tenant to at least two separate individuals who would advertise spaces for rent in their homes. For whatever reason, this person settled on Al, and over the weekend that he was supposed to be moving in, he killed Al and disappeared into thin air. And all of the personal information he had put on his rental application, to include the name of Robert Cooper, was complete fiction. I covered that case because I always found it very eerie in terms of the amount of planning and preparation involved, the victim selection aspect in targeting potential landlords, and the concept of hiding in plain sight, basically, given that he met with people about this room renting and spent some time interacting with them, and then naturally left himself open to being observed by third parties in the midst of his travels. So he clearly didn't balk at being visible to people. It wasn't the stereotypical shadowy figure emerging from the dark at 3 a.m. and creeping into someone's window. The whole MO was just so bizarre in itself, but then there was also the extraordinary level of sadism involved in the murder. I'll link that video in the description for anyone who might be interested in watching it if you haven't seen it already. But the case we're going to get into right now also involves a mysterious but seemingly benign stranger, but we're going to have to step a little further back into the past, to even before my time, which I'm starting to get to say less and less these days, so I relish every opportunity to do so when I can. This incident goes back to 1969 Iowa and a woman named Dorothy Miller. Dorothy Miller was a 48-year-old mother of one and grandmother of two who lived in Burlington, Iowa. Burlington is situated along the eastern border of Iowa, adjacent to Illinois. And incidentally, it's home to a famed street named Snake Alley, which, if you look, gained its moniker from its notoriously twisty path. Dorothy lived with her husband, Fred Miller, who she'd been married to for almost 30 years. She'd previously worked at the local ammunition plant and then as a newspaper proofreader, but for the preceding couple of years, she had found success as a realtor, working for a company where she was the only woman. She was well known around town and had a good reputation personally and professionally. On August 15th, which was a Friday, Dorothy got a call from a man who said his name was Robert Clark. Here we go with another Robert. Robert wanted a showing at a house at 118 Grand Street that same evening. Dorothy made the appointment, but she didn't like showing houses alone at night, so she had her husband come with her. They picked Robert up from a pharmacy at 918 Maple Street and drove him to Grand Street, which is like a 5-minute drive. Fred Miller remembered him as clean cut with short dark hair and about 5'11" and 175 pounds. Robert wasn't really forthcoming about what he did for a living, but he said he was from Des Moines, Iowa, which is almost 3 hours west of Burlington, and that he had a wife and a young child that he was moving to Burlington. Nothing remarkable happened during this initial showing. 118 Grand Street was a 2-story, 2-bedroom house that was unoccupied at the time, and Robert walked around the premises with the Millers without incident, and then they took him back to the pharmacy to drop him off. The next day, he called Dorothy back and said he wanted to see the house again so he could take pictures for his wife. He wanted to meet up that night, but Dorothy wasn't available, so they decided on Monday night at 7:30 p.m. This time he said he would be at the Maple Leaf Tavern, which is near the pharmacy on Maple Street, and that she could call him there when she was ready. After going about her normal course of business on Monday, August 18th, Dorothy called Robert at the Maple Leaf Tavern shortly after 7 p.m. Witnesses at the tavern noted that Robert received a call, left the bar, and got something out of a truck. The truck he was using was described as a black cab-over pickup truck, similar to this one here. Apparently, it looked like it hadn't had a professional factory paint job because it was so dull, like it desperately needed a fresh coat of wax or something, is what I get out of that. That was just something unusual that people remembered about the truck after the fact. FYI, the term cab over just means that the cab of the truck is positioned mostly over or completely over the engine and front axle of the vehicle, which gives it a flat-nosed appearance. This would be another version. I personally didn't know what that term cab over meant with my very limited knowledge of vehicles or vehicle terminology, so I had to look it up and I just thought I'd share. But anyway, after retrieving something unknown out of the truck, Robert walked up Maple Street towards the pharmacy, from where Dorothy presumably picked him up again. Neighbors of 118 Grant Street, who had been out on their front porch at the time, stated they saw Dorothy and Robert pull up at about 8 p.m. and walk into the house together. They never heard anything out of the ordinary or saw anyone exit the house, but they did notice a little while later that Dorothy's car wasn't there anymore. Fred Miller was home getting ready for bed around that time because he managed trash trucks or something, and he got up very early in the morning. So he wasn't awake that night to notice that Dorothy had actually never come back home. It wasn't until he woke up the next day at 5 a.m. that he realized she wasn't there. He called their adult daughter to see if she knew anything, but she hadn't heard from Dorothy either. They met up and went to the area of the Maple Leaf Tavern because they knew Dorothy was supposed to pick up Robert there the night before. They did some canvassing and found her car parked not too far away in the 900 block of Elm Street. The first thing they noticed was that the keys weren't in ignition, and they found that really strange because she never did that. And another peculiar thing was that there was an unused camera flash cube on the front seat, and her purse was nowhere to be found. Given the clear suspicious nature of everything, they went to the police station and reported her missing. The police responded to Dorothy's vehicle first to search for clues, and then they went to 118 Grant Street, since that was her last known intended destination, and it was there that they found her body. She was in an upstairs bedroom closet, lying face down, partially nude, with both of her hands tied in front of her. She had been raped and then stabbed a total of 22 times in the face, back, and neck. The police suspected that Robert Clark, which they determined was most likely an alias, go figure, probably ambushed her right after they got in the house by hitting her in the head with a brick, possibly. There were no signs of a struggle, and that's not surprising given that Dorothy was a small 110-pound woman who was taken by surprise. Now, we'll never know the exact order of operations here, but I would presume that after he knocked her out, or at least stunned her severely with a brick, he then tied her hands up in front of her, carried her upstairs to the bedroom closet where he pushed her dress and her bra up to her neck, removed her underwear and her pantyhose, and then sexually assaulted her before stabbing her to death. On the first floor of the house, the police found a brick and some leftover portion of the same nylon cord that had been used to tie Dorothy up, so that's why they thought the brick may have been used to attack her initially. It was found by the back door, which was unlocked, while the front door had been found locked. That detail is important because it helps in developing some logical theories about what Robert's possible planning process and movements were before actually getting to the house with Dorothy the night of August 18th and then after he murdered her. Firstly, considering the equipment factor, he used a brick, some cord, and a knife. Clearly, those are not things that any halfway intelligent killer would think it's smart to have a future victim see him wielding beforehand, so in terms of what he could easily conceal on his person in a pocket, the cord and the knife would fit that bill. I haven't come across anything in my research that narrows down what kind of knife it was that was used on Dorothy, but whether it was a pocket knife, a hunting knife, a steak knife, a butcher knife, or what have you, none of those are hard to stash somewhere within clothing. Nor would a bundle of cord be. The brick is another story though. That's not an object that a person could easily conceal on himself, so I don't imagine it as something that he had on him when he met up with Dorothy that night. So then the question becomes how the brick came into play. It has been speculated that he had set all this up beforehand, like Perhaps at some point during the initial showing on Friday the 15th, when Dorothy brought her husband, Robert, furtively ensured that the back door was unlocked so that he could re-access the house later on his own, and that he came back at some point to stage the brick someplace where it would be ready and within reach for when he returned with Dorothy. As to what he did immediately after the murder, I think it's likely that he hung around the house for a little while until the coast was clear as far as the neighboring residents go. Because just as there were neighbors that noticed them entering, I think he probably noticed them too. And not wanting to chance being seen leaving the house without Dorothy, which might arouse suspicion, he probably waited around until the neighbors had disappeared. And then to play it safe, he left out the back door, which could be another reason it was unlocked, whether he came back to pre-plan or not. Then he walked around to the front to get to Dorothy's car, drove it to Elm Street and left it, and disappeared into the ether. The authorities obtained information that Robert had been hanging around the Maple Leaf Tavern on the day of the murder since about 4 p.m., although he and Dorothy weren't meeting until 7:30ish. Other patrons gave generally the same description as Fred Miller, recalling Robert as 5'9" to 5'11", clean cut, good looking, with dark hair, and that he looked between 20 and 30 years old with a medium complexion. Dorothy's murder was definitely a very frightening occurrence for a city like Burlington, and it sparked a massive investigation that included the Iowa State Patrol and the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation, now known as the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Authorities conducted door-to-door canvasses and spoke to hundreds of people. They even eventually submitted crime scene evidence to the FBI, as seen here via correspondence bearing the signature of Mr. John Edgar Hoover himself, who was the first director of the FBI. But let's call our attention to what I circled in yellow, because whoever this was written by refers to the suspect with the name of Theodore Arthur Clark, which, of every source I have scoured about this case, including the one with this image, I have found no other reference to this name and where it came from. I'm going to guess that with the authorities knowing that the Robert Clark name was fake, perhaps Theodore Arthur Clark was a different fake name the suspect used at some point, like with other patrons of the Maple Leaf Tavern, possibly, since he used that location as his clubhouse of sorts. And then the police decided to use that identity for official correspondence for whatever reason. It doesn't seem like they consider it a credible identity wherever they got it from, because obviously having a suspect's name would be half the battle. But to reiterate, I literally have no idea why they used Theodore Arthur Clark to refer to the suspect on that paperwork, but it's just a detail I thought I'd point out. They ultimately concluded that his identity and everything he had told other people about himself was either totally or at least partially untrue, that he was not from the area and had left town quickly after murdering Dorothy, and that he was a psychopathic, sexually deviant serial killer who had probably killed before and would kill again. Surprise, surprise. Now, in January of 1968, an Iowa State College freshman named Sheila Jean Collins was murdered. She had put her name on a ride-share board in the University Union to hitch a ride either directly to Evanston, Illinois, where she was from, or at least to somewhere in the vicinity, like the Chicago area, on any given Friday evening. Evanston is 6 hours away from Ames, Iowa, where she was attending school. One Friday evening, she got a call from someone extending a ride offer, and she packed her stuff and walked to an intersection just off campus to meet this person, who she didn't identify to her roommates by name, and she was never seen alive again. Her body was discovered 2 days later in a ditch, partially nude and sexually posed, and she had been strangled to death. The police started looking into strange activity connected with that ride-shared board, namely reports of women who had gotten contacted by weirdos who didn't seem genuine about offering rides, but seemed bent on sexually harassing them and or trying to lure them into meeting somewhere. 6 months after Sheila Jean Collins' murder, after some type of sting the police did, they ran across some creep who admitted to calling at least 30 female students from that board and using fake names. They looked into him for Sheila Jean Collins' murder, and there were some aspects of legitimate suspicion, which I don't want to get into detail about so as not to launch into a whole other case, but ultimately they weren't able to tie him to Sheila's killing after investigating and interviewing him. But when Dorothy Miller was murdered a year and a half later, this guy popped back up into the minds of investigators because of certain similarities. But he was never tied to either murder. And in the case of Sheila Jean Collins, there were several other persons of interest that were considered, but her murder still remains unsolved, as does Dorothy Miller's. As of now, December 2022, it is Burlington PD's oldest cold case. August 18th marked the 53-year anniversary. The Burlington Police Department still tries to keep the case as active as possible, though. Apparently, whenever they send someone to detective school, they toss them the case file right after their training to give fresh eyes a go at it. Forensically, they do appear to have some type of DNA evidence, and they are hoping that that will eventually be the key that solves Dorothy Miller's murder. In 2009, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation established a cold case unit with federal grant money, and her file was part of a group of cases deemed possible to solve with advanced DNA techniques. Unfortunately, the grant money ran out in 2011, and so it's a matter of submitting DNA for testing only if a strong lead develops or a more modern analysis technique becomes available. That would solve question number one at least, which is, who was this guy? And then there's question number two. Why Dorothy Miller? He clearly targeted her, calling her at work under the guise of being a possible home buyer, so it wasn't a crime of opportunity. He already had her in his sights. Of course, in real estate, putting yourself out there and self-promoting is a key component to attracting clients and getting sales, and as the only woman at her company, Dorothy probably stood out a bit. So the most logical explanation is that he saw her on some type of professional advertising material and became fixated with her and planned her murder in advance. And he was dedicated enough to his plan to try not just once, not just twice, but 3 times. He most likely intended to kill her on the initial showing, but was thwarted by her husband coming along. Even still, he didn't flinch and he wasn't put off. He played it normal as the dutiful husband looking for the perfect family home and clearly didn't set off any alarm bells for Dorothy or her husband. Then he called her the very next day to try to meet that night, but she couldn't see him then. And he wasn't deterred by her unavailability. He was willing to wait. And then on Monday night, when she was comfortable enough to meet him alone, he raped her and killed her. So in terms of what connects this incident in my mind with Kite is that spooky wolf in sheep's clothing element of biding time and gaining someone's trust and luring them into a comfort zone, ultimately in the hopes of isolating them alone in a safe space to murder them, which is what happened in both of these cases, which is a very distinctive and creepy MO, almost to the point where it's briefly worth considering whether it might even be the same person, decades apart. And I did have a brief conversation with a retired detective buddy of mine where we toyed with the notion of, what if it was the same person? The victims are dissimilar in terms of their sex, obviously. Dorothy Miller was a female and Kite was a male, and there was a sexual element to Dorothy's murder and not to Kite's. And the suspect would have had to have been on the lower end of the adult age range in 1969, and a little older than estimated in 2004 with Kite, which I think had that suspect in his late 40s at most. But let's say he was like 20 in 1969. He'd be 55, 35 years later in 2004 when Kite was murdered. So a little older than estimated then, but the ages in both cases are just estimates anyway because no one knows who it is. So there's that. In the grand scheme of things, is it possible it's the same person in a Hollywood level plot device kind of way? Sure. Is it plausible? No. Dorothy Miller seemed to be targeted as a woman whose profession left her open to a certain vulnerability that all real estate agents face and that they commonly meet with strangers in unoccupied spaces. And given that that's a normal part of their job, it's a perfect way to be lured into a trap by a person with nefarious intentions. And Dorothy Miller is just one example of a real estate agent who has been the unfortunate victim of a scheme like that. For instance, a similar situation occurred not too long after Dorothy Miller's murder in Alberta, Canada in 1971. A real estate agent in the city of Edmonton named Mary Ann Plett had an appointment on September 15th to meet with a James Cooper to show him a property and was never seen alive again. Her remains weren't found until April of 1972, about 100 miles away from the property she had shown, and only a skull and some of her bones were found, so there's no way to determine exactly what happened to her or how she died. And just like Dorothy Miller, her killer has never been identified either. All in all, real estate isn't typically a dangerous profession from the average day-to-day perspective, and these murders are clearly outliers, but they do highlight how vulnerable real estate agents ultimately are in those instances where they're meeting strangers at unoccupied properties or holding open houses where a fluid group of strangers are coming in and out. As a matter of fact, the National Association of Realtors compiles a member safety report on an annual basis, and for 2021, it reported that 41% of its members have feared for their personal safety at a showing, 32% have feared for their safety when meeting a new client for the first time at a secluded location, and 25% have feared for their safety at an open house. Dorothy Miller did take a perfectly sensible precaution when she met with Robert Cooper the first time by bringing along her husband, so what's really scary about whoever that was that he didn't even get spooked by that. He played along and made her feel comfortable enough to have no qualms about meeting him alone the second time around, and that's when he bounced. So he was clearly intent on hurting her to a very chilling degree, and he succeeded, unfortunately. And so that was the murder of Dorothy Miller, which is now over 53 years old and still unsolved as of December 2022. So take heed, real estate professionals, or anyone in any profession, or just anyone at all. Try to be cognizant of possible angles of stranger danger. Stay aware and try to stay safe. Until next time.